Have you ever heard the story of Steve Jobs, who dropped out of college and became one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history? While it's a compelling story, it's important to be cautious about using it as a blueprint for success. In fact, relying on single anecdotes to make a broad generalization can be a type of logical fallacy that can lead to errors in judgment and decision-making. In this video, I'll explain what type of fallacy this is, how it can manipulate your thinking, and how to avoid falling into these traps. So, if you're interested in learning more about critical thinking and evidence-based decision-making, keep watching. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the story of Steve Jobs. Yes, he dropped out of college, but he was also a brilliant and charismatic individual with a unique vision for the future of technology. He was passionate about his work, and he put in the effort to make his ideas a reality. Jobs' story is truly exceptional, and it's not the norm. The vast majority of people who drop out of college don't go on to achieve the same level of success. This is where the fallacy of hasty generalization comes in. A fallacy of hasty generalization is when someone makes a conclusion based on limited or incomplete information. It occurs when someone draws a general conclusion from a few specific instances without considering a larger context or all the relevant information. For example, if someone meets one rude person from a certain country and concludes that all people from that country are rude, they would be committing the fallacy of hasty generalization. In the example of Steve Jobs, if we try to apply Steve Jobs' experience to everyone, we're ignoring the many other factors that contributed to his success, such as his natural talent and his willingness to take risks. To get a better sense of the real impact of college education, we need to look at the larger picture and consider reliable data on the long-term outcomes for college graduates versus those who don't complete their degrees. For example, we might look at studies that track graduates over a decade or more to see how their education has affected their career path and earning potential. As we've seen, using single anecdotes to make a sweeping generalization about the value of college education can be misleading and even dangerous. A more informed and intelligent approach is to look at the bigger picture and ask questions like, what percentage of college dropouts in the US have found good jobs and achieved financial success? What percentage have had to work low-paying or menial jobs? How many dropouts regret their decision to leave college? How many have decided to return to complete their education? And it's worth noting that these statistics can vary widely depending on the country and the economic and political conditions at the time. So it's essential to take a nuanced and evidence-based approach when evaluating the impact of education on our lives. Now, it's possible that you, the person watching this video, are a true genius and an exception to the norm, but it's important to remember that relying solely on your genius and exceptionality when making decisions can be risky and unwise. Just because something worked for someone else or because you're confident in your own abilities doesn't mean that you can blindly ignore the odds and take an uncalculated risk. Instead, it's important to approach decision-making from a more rational and calculated perspective. Even if you believe you're a genius, it's better to assume that you're an average person when considering your options. This allows you to choose a path that has a realistic potential for success and then use your own exceptional abilities and hard work to increase your chance to success even further. Now, let's consider another example to illustrate this point. But before we move on, let me know if you've enjoyed the video so far. If you found it helpful, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. You've probably heard of Winston Churchill, the famous British politician and Prime Minister. If I told you that he didn't have a healthy diet, was overweight, drank alcohol, and smoked, but lived to be 90 years old, I wouldn't be lying about him. However, if I were to use this information to convince you that having a healthy lifestyle is not important and that you can safely ignore your health, I would be committing the fallacy of hasty generalization. Basically, I would be relying on a single, exceptional case and the fame of individual to avoid providing scientific data and downplay the importance of medical and health advice. This type of thinking can be dangerous, as it ignores the vast amount of evidence that suggests a healthy lifestyle is critical for good health. Just because someone lived a long life despite having some unhealthy habits does not mean that those habits are without consequence. Churchill's longevity is likely due to a combination of factors that we may not be aware of, such as his genetics or other lifestyle choices. So, while his example may be interesting, it's not a reliable justification for ignoring the importance of a healthy lifestyle. Let's take the example of former US President Barack Obama. Despite being the son of immigrants from Kenya and facing many challenges, including poverty and discrimination, he was able to overcome these obstacles and eventually become the first African American president of the United States. While Obama's story is certainly inspiring and can serve as a source of motivation for many people, it's important to recognize that his success is not the norm for all immigrants to the United States. In fact, there are many immigrants who have faced similar or even greater challenges but have not achieved the same level of success as Obama. Therefore, using Obama's story as an example of what all immigrants to the US can achieve would be committing the fallacy of hasty generalization. It's important to acknowledge the diverse experiences and outcomes of immigrants and to avoid making assumptions based on exceptional cases like Obama's. Instead, we should strive to learn from his story and work towards creating a more equitable society for all, regardless of their background and circumstances. The success stories of famous and exceptional individuals are often published in best-selling books, and millions of copies are sold. I'm not saying this is inherently bad. We should all strive to learn from these successful and outstanding people and be inspired by their life stories to improve our own lives. However, at the same time, we should not forget that there are millions of so-called unsuccessful people who have always existed and still exist, and whose life stories are not attractive enough for any publisher to release them. The point is, our minds are wired to process and retain stories better than data and figures. Hearing a story and believing it comes much more naturally to us than digesting scientific facts and statistical numbers. This makes it easy to be swayed by an emotionally compelling story, even if it's not entirely accurate. Our love for stories is deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. For thousands of years, stories have been the primary way that humans pass down information and wisdom to future generations. So it's no surprise that we still tend to gravitate towards stories over facts, even in the modern world. Yuval Noah Harari, a well-known historian and author, has also emphasized this point. He has stated that humans think in stories rather than in facts, numbers, or equations. And the simpler the story, the better. In other words, we are naturally drawn to stories that are easy to understand and remember, even if they may not be entirely accurate. This is something we should keep in mind when processing information and making decisions. Given this aspect of our brain function, we need to be aware of potential pitfalls of generalizing from exceptional success stories. Before making any major decisions that could impact our future, it's important to carefully consider scientific data and statistics. Making decisions based solely on anecdotal evidence or inspirational stories without taking into account the larger context and relevant data can lead to misguided choices that may have long-term consequences. So, while we should certainly take inspiration from exceptional people, we should also be sure to supplement that inspiration with rigorous research and analysis. By combining inspiration with scientific data and analysis, we can avoid hasty generalization and make more informed choices, setting ourselves up for a brighter future. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. Until next time, take care and keep learning.